vanished in the desert. The strange disappearance of Daniel Robinson. If you're not afraid of the dark side of real life, hit that subscribe button. Because after this story, you might think twice before driving into the desert alone. The Jeep was found upside down in a dry Arizona ravine, half buried in sand. The airbags had deployed, the windshield cracked like a spider web, and the doors hung open as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside sat a wallet, a phone, and a folded work vest. But the driver, 24-year-old geologist Daniel Robinson, was gone. No footprints led away from the scene. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just emptiness. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. When police arrived, the temperature had already reached 104 degrees. The desert air shimmered with heat, and the only sound was the buzzing of flies around the shattered glass. One officer squinted toward the horizon and said, "If he walked out there, he's dead." But Daniel's father didn't believe that. He stood near the wreck, staring at the car that had carried his son across the country, now abandoned and lifeless. Something about it felt staged, too clean, too wrong. Weeks later, people would still argue about what happened here. Some said Daniel got lost in the heat. Others whispered he was running from something, or someone. But no one could explain the strange clues that came next. Daniel Robinson wasn't the kind of person to just disappear. He was driven, intelligent, and passionate about his work. Fresh out of college, he had moved from South Carolina to Arizona for a geologist job, exploring drilling sites and studying soil for a local company. Friends described him as calm, respectful, and curious. He was the kind of guy who looked for meaning in everything. Rocks, stars, even people. But in the weeks before he vanished, Daniel's behavior started to shift. He texted a co-worker about feeling different lately, and a friend later said Daniel had become distant, distracted, like something was weighing on him. The day before he disappeared, he'd attended a small party at a friend's house. Witnesses said he was quiet that night, sitting alone on the porch, staring out into the desert. When someone asked if he was okay, Daniel just smiled and said, "Yeah, just thinking about something big." June 23rd, 2021. A date his family will never forget. At 7:00 a.m., Daniel left his apartment in Buckeye, Arizona, and headed toward a drilling site deep in the desert. He texted a woman he'd recently met. "Headed out west today. See you soon." She never replied. By 9:00 a.m., he arrived at the work site and met another field tech named Ken. At first, everything seemed normal, but Ken later told investigators that Daniel's mood was strange. He was distracted, pacing around the truck, saying things like, "I just feel like I need to go." Then, without warning, Daniel climbed into his Jeep, waved to Ken, and drove off, straight into the open desert, away from the road. Ken shouted after him, but Daniel didn't stop. The blue Jeep shrank in the distance until it was nothing but a shimmer against the sand. Hours passed. No one heard from him again. When Daniel didn't return home that night, his family called the police. Buckeye officers began a standard missing person search, sending out patrols and helicopters. But the desert was endless, and every hour that passed meant another degree of heat, another chance that Daniel was too far gone. On the third day, a search team found tire tracks, faint lines in the sand that stretched miles away from the drilling site. They followed them for hours until they suddenly stopped near a dry riverbed. The desert had swallowed the rest. Then, almost a month later, a rancher found the Jeep. The crash site was strange. The ravine was shallow enough that anyone could have walked away. But the way the Jeep had landed made no sense. There were signs it had been started multiple times after the crash, and the odometer showed an extra 11 miles that couldn't be explained. Inside, Daniel's phone and wallet were untouched. His clothes were neatly folded in the back seat. No one could understand why. When investigators downloaded data from the car, they discovered something even more confusing. The airbag had deployed at 1:00 p.m., hours after Daniel left work. But there were no other cars nearby, no skid marks, no evidence of a chase or collision. It was as if the Jeep had been deliberately crashed. Police called it a possible voluntary disappearance, but Daniel's father refused to accept that. "My son didn't just walk away from his life," he told reporters. "Something happened to him out there. He flew from South Carolina to Arizona and began searching the desert himself, day after day under the brutal sun. He found clothing scraps, empty bottles, even bones that turned out to belong to someone else. Each discovery tore at him, but he wouldn't stop." Online, Daniel's story began to spread. People compared it to other disappearances in the Arizona desert, cases where bodies were never found, where phones stopped pinging, where cars were left like offerings to the sand. But one clue stood out. A private investigator, hired by the Robinson family, reviewed Daniel's phone data. The last text he sent before disappearing wasn't to a friend or coworker. It was to a woman he'd met after delivering a package to her neighborhood weeks earlier. The message was short and cryptic. "You changed everything for me." When police questioned her, she said Daniel had shown up at her house unannounced a few times and left gifts at her door. She told him she wasn't interested. Days later, he vanished. It could have been coincidence, or it could have been the key to everything. By late July, more than 40 volunteers had joined the search. Drones, horses, ATVs. They combed every stretch of the desert. And just when everyone was losing hope, one of the drones spotted something odd. A dark circular patch of ground a few miles from the crash. Investigators hiked out there and found a shallow pit, partially covered with brush. Inside were scraps of metal, a torn glove, and a bracelet engraved with a single word: faith. Daniel's mother had given it to him before he left home. That night, his father sat beside the pit, staring at the stars that Daniel used to love studying. He whispered, "I'm close, son. I can feel it." But what he didn't know was that something, or someone, had been watching the search from a distance. The next morning, a volunteer found tire tracks near the ravine. Fresh ones. They didn't belong to police or the search team. Someone else had been there in the night. And whatever they were doing, they didn't want to be found. If you think the desert hides secrets, wait until you see what it gives back. Hit subscribe, because this part of the story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Daniel Robinson case. By the time the fresh tire tracks were found, the search had entered its 5th week. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees, and the desert was beginning to eat itself alive. The wind scraping sand across metal and bone. Every day, Daniel's father, David Robinson, led teams into the heat, refusing to stop. His clothes were soaked with sweat, his lips cracked, but he wouldn't go home. He stood near the ravine that morning, staring at those fresh tracks pressed into the sand. They curved around the crash site and vanished into the distance. They weren't from police. They weren't from volunteers. Someone had been there in the dark, close enough to touch Daniel's Jeep. "Whoever came back," David muttered. "They know something." The local police brushed it off, saying it could have been ranchers or off-roaders. But the tracks were too clean, too deliberate. Someone had driven there, stopped, then turned back. No one could explain why. That night, David returned to his motel room and sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through photos of his son. He stared at Daniel's bright smile, the way his dreadlocks framed his face, and the soft confidence in his eyes. Then he looked at the Jeep crash photos. The difference between them was unbearable. Daniel had always been a quiet soul, thoughtful but brave. He loved music, astronomy, and long drives under open skies. The desert was his peace. But something about that peace had turned on him. When a private investigator named Jeff McGrath joined the case, things started to move. Jeff was a retired police officer, known for his patience and his sharp eye for inconsistencies. After reviewing the crash scene photos, he shook his head. "This wasn't a normal accident," he said flatly. He explained that the Jeep had sustained multiple impacts, but there were no signs of Daniel being injured or disoriented. The data from the car's computer revealed the engine had been turned on several times after the airbags deployed. Someone was inside the Jeep after the crash. Police had missed that. Jeff drove out to the ravine with a drone and retraced the route Daniel might have taken from the job site. The dirt tracks wound through rocky terrain, miles from any road. Then he noticed something chilling. The Jeep's tire impressions overlapped at points, like it had been circling the same area before crashing, as if someone was trying to confuse anyone who came looking. Meanwhile, the woman Daniel had texted before he vanished, the one he'd met briefly through work, gave a new statement to police. She said Daniel had visited her home uninvited a week before his disappearance and left a small package at her door. A rock, wrapped in a note that said, "The universe brought me here." When she told him not to come again, Daniel apologized and said he understood. But then, according to her, he looked her in the eye and said something that haunted her later. "I won't be around much longer." Police thought it was a clue to possible mental distress, but Jeff didn't buy it. "People don't plan a disappearance by crashing their car and leaving everything behind," he said. "Someone wanted this to look like he walked off." As the days dragged on, rumors began spreading online. Some thought Daniel was kidnapped by a local cartel that operated in the desert. Others believed he'd uncovered something dangerous at one of his work sites, maybe illegal drilling or toxic dumping, and someone wanted him silenced. But then came a tip that changed everything. A hiker found a human skull less than 5 miles from where Daniel's Jeep had been discovered. The area was cordoned off and investigators rushed in. David Robinson's heart sank. He waited by the phone for 2 endless days before hearing from the medical examiner. It wasn't Daniel. The skull belonged to another missing man, one reported missing 6 months earlier. His body had never been found. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. 2 men gone in the same area, both leaving little trace behind. Now, the story wasn't just about Daniel. It was about what was happening in that desert. Weeks turned into months. David's search team, made up of volunteers from across the country, started mapping the terrain using drones and GPS. One afternoon, a volunteer spotted something shiny buried in the sand, not far from the Jeep's location. It was a wristwatch. Daniel's. The hands were frozen at 1:37 p.m. That detail struck Jeff immediately. The crash data showed the airbags had deployed around 1 o'clock p.m. So what happened in those missing 37 minutes? If Daniel had survived the crash, where did he go? Some volunteers theorized he'd wandered off in a heat-driven haze, but that didn't explain the car data or the untouched belongings. Others whispered that maybe someone followed him out there. Then, during a late-night review of cell tower records, Jeff made a discovery that sent chills down his spine. Daniel's phone had pinged not just once after the crash, but 3 times. The last ping came nearly 4 hours later, about 2 miles west of the crash site. Someone had moved his phone. When police were confronted with the new data, they said it wasn't enough to reopen the case. "No sign of foul play," they repeated. But David and Jeff weren't giving up. They expanded the search area westward, toward the direction of that last phone ping. On the 3rd day of the extended search, a volunteer radioed in, "We've got something." David and Jeff raced toward the coordinates. When they arrived, the sun was setting in a haze of orange and blood-red light. The volunteer pointed to a cluster of rocks that looked out of place. Beneath them, half buried, was a black backpack. Inside, they found a few water bottles, a torn shirt, and a notebook smeared with sand. The first page was blank, but the next had a message written in faint pencil. "I didn't want to leave, but I can't go back." The handwriting matched Daniel's. Jeff stared at it for a long time. "This wasn't random," he said. "This was planned. Or someone wanted it to look that way. David gripped the notebook, his knuckles white. "If my son wrote this," he whispered, "then someone made him." That night, when David returned to his motel, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number appeared. "Stop looking." No name, no number traceable. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Then, the phone buzzed again. Another message. "You're next." The room felt suddenly smaller. The desert outside the window Leekholm oaked darker than ever. He called Jeff immediately, who told him to save the messages and not respond. But by the time investigators traced the source, the number had disappeared. Whoever sent those texts knew exactly what David was doing, and where he was. The next morning, when the search team gathered near the crash site again, they noticed something disturbing. The black backpack was gone, completely vanished. All that remained was the imprint of where it had been buried. And for the first time since his son disappeared, David Robinson began to wonder if this wasn't just about Daniel anymore. Something else was happening in that desert. Something much bigger. If you think you've heard everything about Daniel Robinson, think again. This is the part that no one saw coming. The part that still keeps people awake at night. Subscribe now, because what happens next will change the way you look at this case forever. The morning after the backpack vanished, the Arizona desert felt heavier. Like the air itself was hiding something. David Robinson stood in silence at the ravine, the same place his son's Jeep had been found. The sand shimmered in the heat, the smell of gasoline still faint in the air. He clenched his fists. "Whoever's playing this game," he muttered, "I'm not stopping." Jeff McGrath arrived minutes later, his truck kicking up dust behind him. "The backpack didn't just walk away," he said grimly. "Someone came back." They searched the area again, inch by inch, but there were no new tracks, no signs of disturbance, as if the ground had been swept clean overnight. The desert erases things fast, but not that fast. Then Jeff noticed something odd, a small piece of torn paper fluttering near a cactus. He picked it up carefully. It was a corner of notebook paper, the same kind Daniel's note had been written on. Faded words were scrawled across it in pencil. "They know." "Who's they?" David whispered. Jeff didn't answer, but his expression said everything. By now, national media had picked up the story. Reporters camped outside the Buckeye Police Department. Talk shows debated theories. Abduction, mental breakdown, foul play, even government cover-up. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had proof. Still, something was happening behind the scenes. Jeff received an anonymous email late one night. The subject line read, "If you want the truth, follow the water." Attached was a single map, a satellite image showing a dry riverbed about 8 miles from the crash site. There were no names, no coordinates, just a red X drawn over a bend in the river. Jeff showed it to David the next morning. "This could be a prank," he warned. David's voice was steady. "Or it could be my son." They decided to check it out themselves before alerting the police. By mid-afternoon, the two men reached the riverbed. The air was suffocatingly hot, the landscape barren, except for scattered mesquite trees and old mining debris. As they followed the dry channel, Jeff noticed something glinting under the sand. A piece of blue plastic. He brushed it off carefully. It was the shattered corner of a taillight. The serial number matched Daniel's Jeep. But it made no sense. The Jeep had already been recovered miles away. How did another piece end up here? They walked further down the riverbed. Then, about 50 yards ahead, David froze. "Jeff," he said quietly, pointing. Something was sticking out of the ground. It looked like a half-buried tarp, weighed down by rocks. They approached slowly. Jeff knelt and pulled the tarp back. What they found underneath stopped him cold. A second vehicle. It was an old sand-colored pickup, stripped of its plates and burned from the inside out. The windows were melted, the frame warped. Someone had torched it deliberately. Inside the driver's seat was a blackened laptop bag, still sealed. Jeff used geologist to open it. Inside were fragments of paperwork, an ID badge from a mining company, and a flash drive partially melted at the edge. The name on the badge wasn't Daniel Robinson. It belonged to another geologist who'd vanished in Arizona the year before. A man named Mark Harrison. The pieces were falling into place. 2 missing men, both geologists, both connected to the same company, both gone in the same desert. Jeff felt a cold sweat on his neck. This isn't a coincidence. They contacted authorities immediately. Within hours, FBI agents were on site, cordoning off the area. But just as they began documenting evidence, a sandstorm rolled in. Fast, violent, and blinding. Visibility dropped to almost zero. By the time it cleared, the flash drive was gone. Completely gone. No one could explain how. Days later, the lab confirmed something disturbing. The burned truck had traces of gasoline residue mixed with a rare industrial solvent, the kind used in deep drilling operations. The same solvent Daniel had been working with before he disappeared. Investigators quietly began probing the company Daniel worked for. Within weeks, they discovered reports of unlicensed drilling, improper waste disposal, and falsified geological data, all buried beneath corporate silence. And then, out of nowhere, the anonymous emails started again. He found something he wasn't supposed to. They made it look like an accident. David read them over and over. He didn't know whether to believe them, but every instinct told him the same thing. Daniel had uncovered something, and it had cost him his life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the desert hills, David returned to the ravine one last time. The search had gone on for nearly a year. He stood at the edge of the pit, where his son's jeep had once rested. He whispered, "I'm sorry, son. I tried." Then his phone beeps, Uzed. A new text. No contact name. It read, "You were never supposed to find the river." His blood ran cold. Before he could react, a low rumble echoed from the distance, the sound of an engine. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing closer, bouncing through the dust. Jeff, standing beside him, shouted, "David, get down!" The truck stopped about 50 yards away. The headlights stayed on, blinding them. Then, just as suddenly, they turned off. Silence. When they approached the spot moments later, the truck was gone. No tire marks, no sound, nothing but the echo of the wind. 2 days later, a package arrived at Jeff's office. No return address. Inside was a flash drive. New, clean, unburned. The same brand as the one that had disappeared in the sandstorm. When Jeff opened it, there was only one file. A video. The footage was grainy, time-stamped June 23, 2021. The day Daniel vanished. It showed Daniel standing beside his jeep, recording a message with his phone. His voice was calm but urgent. "If you're watching this, something's gone wrong. They told me to stay quiet, but I can't. The site isn't safe. They're hiding something underground. If I disappear, tell my dad I love him." The video ended there. No location, no clues, just Daniel's final words. The file was turned over to federal investigators, but officially, the case remains open. There's still no body, no confirmed cause, no one charged. Daniel Robinson is still missing. Some say he ran away, others say he was silenced. But for those who've searched that desert, who've stood where his jeep was found, who've seen the evidence disappear and reappear like ghosts, there's no doubt left. Something happened out there. Something powerful enough to bury the truth beneath miles of sand. And as for the man who sent that video, no one ever traced the IP address. To this day, when the wind howls through the Buckeye Desert at night, locals swear they sometimes see headlights flicker near the ravine. A blue glow moving across the dunes before vanishing into the dark. And that's where the story ends. Or maybe where it begins again. If you think this story was wild, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because the desert still has secrets, and we're not done digging.